Claude responded. My name is Walter Doyle, and I spent 38 years as a structural engineer before I retired, which means I spent 38 years being the person Abu. My name is Walter Doyle, and I spent 38 years as a structural engineer before I retired, which means I spent 38 years being the person a building trusts to hold its weight without anyone else noticing the math underneath. I mention this because it matters later. It matters because when my son-in-law started asking me questions about load-bearing walls in my own house, I was the only person in the room who understood exactly what he was really asking. The teller's name was Denise. I'd been going to that branch of Fifth Third Bank on Montgomery Road in Cincinnati for 14 years, and Denise had been behind that counter for 9 of them. She knew my coffee order from the drive-thru 2 doors down because we'd talked about it once, 4 years ago, and she'd never forgotten. She asked about my late wife, Carol, by name, every single time, for the 2 years since Carol had passed, because Denise was the kind of person who understood that grief doesn't come with an expiration date stamped on it. On a Tuesday morning in November, I walked through those glass doors at 9:40 a.m. and approached her window and asked to withdraw $4,200 from my personal savings account to cover a roof repair. Denise smiled at me the way she always did. She asked for my ID. I handed it to her. She typed. She looked at the screen, and then she went still. It wasn't the ordinary stillness of a person processing a routine request. I know stillness. I spent nearly 4 decades reading blueprints for a living, learning to notice the difference between a line that means nothing and a line that means the whole structure is compromised. This was the second kind of stillness. She looked at that screen a beat too long, and when she looked back up at me, her professional composure was working overtime to stay in place. Mr. Doyle, she said, could you give me just 1 moment, please? She picked up the phone at her station. She turned her body a few degrees away from me, lowered her voice, and I couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm of someone relaying something carefully. She hung up and looked at me again. Someone's going to come speak with you. Just give us 1 moment. I said, Denise, what's going on? She said, I'm going to have Mr. Alvarez come out. He's our branch manager. It'll just be a moment, Mr. Doyle. She'd used my name twice inside of 30 seconds. That's a thing people do when they're trying to make an uncomfortable situation feel survivable. I'd sat across the table from enough anxious contractors and enough city inspectors over the years to recognize the shape of it immediately. I stepped aside, near the little counter with the deposit slips, and I waited. Around me, the branch went on with its Tuesday morning business, a mother juggling a toddler and a stack of rolled coins, an old man in a Bengals cap arguing gently with an ATM, the low hum of nothing being wrong for anyone else in the room. About a minute later, a side door opened, and a man in his 40s in a gray suit came toward me with the specific expression of someone who has been told exactly how to look before walking into a room. He put his hand out. Mr. Doyle, I'm Marcus Alvarez, branch manager. Would you mind stepping into my office for just a moment? I followed him. His office had the particular staged calm of a room designed to deliver bad news. Gently soft chair, a box of tissues angled just so on the corner of the desk, framed photo of his kids, turned slightly toward the visitor's side. I assume so you'd remember he was a person too. He sat. He turned his monitor toward me. Mr. Doyle, he said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Did you authorize a withdrawal from this account yesterday afternoon? I said I had not been to the bank yesterday afternoon. He turned the monitor another few degrees. Someone came in yesterday at 3:52 p.m. and withdrew $31,000 from this account. Cash. They presented a withdrawal slip with what appears to be your signature and a photo ID. I sat with that for a moment, the way you sit with a number on a blueprint that doesn't add up to what the drawing says it should. I asked to see the footage. He pulled it up without hesitation, angled the monitor toward me, and there, in grainy overhead color, was a young woman in a gray coat and a baseball cap pulled low, handing something across the counter to a teller I didn't recognize, waiting with her hands folded, taking an envelope, and walking out through the same glass doors I'd walked through 100 times. I knew that gray coat. Carol had bought it for her 3 Christmases ago. I said, "That's my daughter." Mr. Alvarez didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, the way people talk when they've been trained not to say the wrong thing, "Mr. Doyle, I have to inform you this is now a fraud investigation, and we'll need you to file a police report. I'm very sorry. I want to explain something before I go further, because it matters for understanding everything that comes after." I was not surprised. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering at this point in a story like this one. I had known for 3 weeks. I had spent those 3 weeks quietly getting ready. Carol and I had 2 children. Our son, Thomas, lived 40 minutes away in Dayton, worked as a paramedic, called me every Sunday night, and had, on 2 separate occasions over the past year, told me gently that he was worried about his sister and thought I should be careful with her. I had heard him both times. I had not moved quickly enough on what I'd heard, and I want to own that, the way I'd own a miscalculation on a load estimate, not with shame exactly, but with the clear-eyed accounting of a person who believes the record should say what actually happened. Our daughter, Renee, was 41. She lived in a nice house in Mason, with her husband, Kyle, and their son, and Kyle worked in commercial real estate and had the specific manner of a man who calculates precisely how much warmth a room requires and delivers exactly that much and not 1 degree more. He shook my hand firmly at every holiday. He asked about my knee replacement at the right moments. In 11 years of being my son-in-law, he had never once said anything to me that wasn't calibrated. Renee was smart. She'd always been smart, smarter than she gave herself credit for, and smart in a way that, when it didn't have somewhere good to go, tended to curdle into a kind of restlessness that made her hard to be around for stretches at a time. Carol used to say Renee would find her footing eventually, and I deferred to Carol on things like that, because Carol understood people the way I understood steel instinctively and correctly almost every time. Carol died 2 years ago, in March. Renee started asking about the house within 6 weeks. The questions were framed the right way, the way careful questions are always framed. She mentioned a friend whose father had passed without updating a will and the mess that followed. She mentioned that Kyle had some experience with estate matters through his work and would be glad to look things over if it would help. She mentioned, more than once, that the house on Sycamore Lane was probably worth a good amount in this market, and that it might be smart to understand what that meant before anything happened to it. Before anything happened to it. I wrote that phrase down. I've kept a work notebook for 38 years. Every site visit, every client call, every number that mattered, dated and logged, because in structural engineering, a note you don't write down is a note that didn't happen. I wrote that phrase down the way I wrote down every conversation with Renee after that, because some part of me had already started building the file before I let myself admit why. By that August, Renee was asking about my online banking. She said she worried about me managing things alone. She said Kyle had set up automatic bill pay for his own mother, and it had made everything so much simpler. She offered to configure it for me. She just needed my username and password, she said, so she could set it up properly. I told her I'd been managing my own accounts online for 9 years and felt perfectly capable of continuing to do so. She said she just wanted to help. I said I appreciated that. I wrote it down. In October, I came home from the hardware store to find Renee in my study. She had a reason ready. She'd come by to drop off a casserole and noticed my desk lamp flickering and thought she'd take a look at the wiring while she waited for me. My laptop, which I always closed but rarely powered down, was open on the desk, the screen dimmed but not locked. I didn't say anything that day. I wrote it down. In January, I got a call from my credit union asking if I'd recently applied for a home equity line of credit. I had not. Someone had submitted an application using my social security number and my address, requesting a $60,000 line against the house on Sycamore Lane. The application had been flagged and denied because I'd placed a credit freeze on all 3 bureaus 2 years earlier, right after Carol died, back when a financial advisor at her memorial had quietly suggested it as standard practice for a surviving spouse. That freeze, I understood later, was the only reason that application didn't go through. I want you to sit with that timeline the way I sat with it. A daughter, watching her father's grief, deciding it looked like an opening. I didn't confront her. I want to explain why, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, more than the money, more than what came after. I am an engineer. My entire career was built on one principle. You do not act on a hunch when the building is still standing. You gather your measurements. You confirm your loads. You build your case in a way that will hold up under the specific kind of scrutiny that comes later. Because when a structure fails, everyone wants an explanation, and I had a feeling has never once satisfied an inspector. So starting in March, I began documenting everything with the same discipline I'd applied to every site report of my career. I dated every conversation with Renee. I noted every unusual login I could detect on my banking app. I contacted my bank and asked them, quietly, to flag any large or unusual activity on my account and to call me directly, not just send a text if anything came through. I moved the bulk of my savings into a separate account at a different institution, one Renee didn't know existed, and I left $4,200 in the account she did know about, not because I needed that specific amount, but because it was small enough to feel plausible as bait and large enough that if someone took it, a bank would be obligated to treat it seriously. I called that account the porch light. You leave it on, and you wait to see who comes to the door. 3 weeks before I walked into that branch, I received an alert that someone had accessed my online banking from a device I didn't recognize at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I didn't act. I wrote it down. 10 days later, another login. This one lasting 14 minutes, long enough to look at account balances and transaction history. I wrote that down too. And then, on a Monday, I got the call from Marcus Alvarez's branch, not Marcus himself yet, just an automated fraud alert asking me to confirm a withdrawal I hadn't made. I confirmed I had not made it. They reversed nothing yet, because the transaction was already 3 days old and the money was gone, but they opened a file. That file is what Marcus Alvarez pulled up on his monitor the day I walked in to withdraw my $4,200 and instead learned my daughter had taken $31,000 out of an account using a forged signature and a photo ID. I still don't fully understand how she obtained. I filed the police report that same afternoon. I sat across from a detective named Ellen Voss, a woman with the kind of patient, unhurried manner that told me she'd done this 100 times and had stopped being surprised by any version of it. I handed her my notebook, 8 months of dated entries, the credit freeze confirmation, the flagged home equity application, the 2 suspicious logins, the porch light account. She looked through about a third of it before she looked up at me and said, "Mr. Doyle, most people who come in here have nothing. You built an entire file." I said, "I've spent my whole life being the person who has to prove a building won't fall down before anyone else believes it. I wasn't going to walk into a police station with a feeling." She almost smiled. She said, "We'll open the investigation. I'll be in touch." I called Thomas from the parking lot. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been waiting for something without knowing what. I told him everything, the bank, the footage, the gray coat, the notebook, the porch light. He was quiet the whole way through, the particular quiet of a paramedic who's learned to listen fully before he responds to anything. When I finished, he said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I said, "Since March." I didn't say anything, because I didn't want you carrying something you couldn't do anything about yet. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm clear. That's the best word I've got for it right now." He said, "Do you want me to come up?" I said, "Not yet. There'll be a point where I need you here, and I'll tell you when we're there." He said, "Okay." And then, after a pause, "Mom would have seen this coming a year before you did." I said, "I know. She was always faster than me on people. I'm faster on numbers. It took me longer than it should have." That evening, I drove home to Sycamore Lane and sat on the back porch. In November, light that was already going thin and gold the way it does in Ohio that time of year. And I looked at Carol's garden, which had gotten ragged in the 2 years since she'd gone, not collapsed, because she'd built it with good bones, but blurred at the edges in the specific way a thing blurs when the person who understood its intention isn't there to maintain it anymore. I thought about her garden notebooks in the shed. I went and got them. I sat on that porch for an hour, reading her handwriting, 3 seasons of notes about what needed sun and what needed shade, and what she'd planted for the birds that came through in the fall. And for the first time, I understood, with real precision, what she'd been building and why. The investigation took 9 weeks. Detective Voss called me 3 times. An assistant prosecutor named Diane Feldstein reviewed my file and told me it was, in her words, the most complete civilian documentation she'd seen in a case like this in a decade. What they established was this. Renee had accessed my banking credentials through my laptop during her October visit, using a keylogger she'd installed on a thumb drive while pretending to check my desk lamp. She'd monitored my balances for months. She'd submitted the home equity application in January, blocked by the freeze. She'd forged my signature on the November withdrawal slip and presented a fake ID at a different, smaller branch across town, where a newer teller hadn't caught what Denise would have caught in a heartbeat. The forensic review of Renee's phone, obtained through a warrant, turned up a notes app where she had tracked my account balance changes for 5 months, along with messages to Kyle about the timeline and when it makes sense to move. I met with Renee once, before the plea, at her lawyer's insistence, in a small conference room with a court-appointed mediator present. She looked smaller than I remembered, and older, and for 1 second I felt the particular grief of recognizing your child's face on a stranger. She said, "I thought you weren't paying attention. I thought, with Mom gone, you wouldn't notice for a long time." I said, "I noticed the same week you started asking about the will." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You let it keep going." I said, "I let you keep building the case against yourself. That's different from not noticing." She didn't have anything to say to that. Her lawyer moved us along. Renee entered a guilty plea in the spring. The agreement included full restitution, a suspended sentence, 5 years of probation, and a permanent record. Diane Feldstein called me after and told me the outcome was the strongest one available given the evidence, and I told her I understood, and that I was grateful for the work she'd put into it. The restitution came through in June. I deposited it, and I logged the date in my notebook, the same way I'd logged everything else, because a record isn't finished until the number closes out. Thomas drove up from Dayton the weekend after the plea. We sat on the back porch in June light, and he helped me identify a plant along the back fence that Carol had written about, but that I hadn't been able to place from her notes alone. He remembered it because she'd told him about it once, years ago, on a visit I hadn't been part of. He said, "She planted that for the finches. She said they come through in the fall, and they need something specific." I said, "I've been trying to figure out what it wants." He said, "Less water than you'd think." She wrote that somewhere in one of the notebooks. We found the page later that afternoon. She had written exactly that. Less water than you'd think. That was Carol precise, even in the margins of things nobody else would ever read. We talked about Renee once that day, for maybe 20 minutes, the way you talk about something that's settled but not resolved. Thomas asked how it had gotten this far, and I told him I thought the answer was the same answer. Most of these situations come down to, she believed I wasn't paying attention, and that belief felt comfortable enough to her that the whole plan became real before she ever stopped to account for what actually paying attention looks like. He said, "She should have known you better." I said, "She knew me the way I was 14 years ago before your mother died, before I had a reason to notice things this closely. She never updated the file." He said, "That's a very engineering way to put it." I said, "It's the only way I know how to put things. The garden's coming back now, not to what Carol had it at, not her precision, not her instinct, but better than it was a year ago. I've been following her notebooks as closely as I can, learning, this late, what I should have learned while she was still here to show me directly. The finches came through this past October exactly the way she said they would, and I watched them from the kitchen window some mornings with my coffee, and I think she would have been satisfied by that. Not surprised, just quietly satisfied, the way she always was when something she'd planned carefully turned out exactly the way she'd planned it. That's the thing about the way she built things. She never built for the moment. She built for afterward. I understand that now in a way I didn't when she was alive to explain it to me. I built my documentation the same way, not for the day I'd need it, but for the day after, when having it would be the difference between what was possible and what wasn't. 38 years of professional habit turned toward the one thing in my life that was never supposed to need a blueprint. The record was the record, and in the end, it was mine. If this story hit close to home for you, tell me in the comments which moment got you the most. Hit like if you made it this far with me. And if you're not subscribed yet, come stick around. I've got more of these true stories every week, and I'd be glad to have you back. Claude responded, "Paying attention is the quietest form of love. There is not the dramatic kind, just noticing, writing things down, staying awake to the people around you even. Paying attention is the quietest form of love there is, not the dramatic kind, just noticing, writing things down, staying awake to the people around you even when grief makes that hard." Walter didn't win by being angry. He won by being present, patient, and honest with himself. That's the real inheritance here. Keep your eyes open for the people you love, and let truth, not vengeance, do the work. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a genuine and positive life lesson with you.